All right, so today we have an interesting story to talk about that has definitely been picking up steam online over the past 12 hours or so. And what makes this story interesting to me is that this kind of ties into something we've talked about before in the past, because allegedly a person over on Twitter purchased a used Nintendo Switch 1 game and put that cartridge in their Nintendo Switch 2. And when that happened, their Nintendo Switch 2 was banned from going online after utilizing that cartridge. And there's a lot of people talking about this. I feel like it's going to pick up more steam as time goes on and more people hear about this as well, because it's a very interesting story. It does parlay into something we've talked about before, and how the Nintendo Switch 2 has been allegedly banning certain devices when used on the system from going online. But a used game cartridge, that's kind of a new wrinkle in the story. So I want to talk about all this with you guys and maybe come to some sort of clarifications as far as what is actually happening in this situation. So you might remember we talked a couple of weeks ago about something called the MIG Switch and utilizing this on your Nintendo Switch 2. Now, I have made several videos about the MIG Switch and my experience with the thing, but essentially, in case you've been living under a rock, what the MIG Switch does is that it allows you to essentially dump your Nintendo Switch 1 games onto your computer, put them on a micro SD card, and then utilize the MIG Switch on your Nintendo Switch system. So you could basically make backups of the games that you already own, stick it into the cartridge slot, and then push it in and out of the cartridge slot to cycle through the games. Now, when I got my MIG Switch, I was never even able to get to this point of doing it because they didn't send me the dumper. And with the MIG Switch, you do have to have a certain file type. You can't just go onto a website and download a Nintendo Switch ROM and then throw it onto the MIG Switch. It needs to be a certain file type that is not what is currently used for things like emulation / preservation. But with the MIG Switch, obviously Nintendo was not very happy about this. Allegedly, they took down the website, potentially took over the company. We don't really know the full story of the situation, but it definitely seems like Nintendo did indeed get involved. But with the Nintendo Switch 2, there's been some people that have been reporting that utilizing a MIG Switch on the Nintendo Switch 2 will brick your system from going online. So you could still play single player games on the system and whatnot, but as far as actually utilizing online features and taking your Nintendo Switch 2 online, you're no longer able to do that with the MIG Switch. How the Nintendo Switch 2 kind of realizes that, where the Nintendo Switch 1 couldn't, nobody really knows kind of the answer to that. I think it has to do with the file name, and when you go online, let's say a game like Splatoon 3 or something like that, you take that game online and that game has an ID attached to it. If there are multiple people, sorry, I don't know why my voice cracked there. If there are multiple people that are online with that same cartridge ID, then obviously there is something going on with that. So maybe Nintendo has a way to detect that this is a game that multiple people are using, shouldn't have access to, and then blocks it. But here's what's going on with the new thing, because you kind of got to set the groundwork as far as this kind of making sense. A ginger person named Quinn Nelson, Snazzy Labs, put out this tweet early this morning, actually, talking about a situation that they are having with the Nintendo Switch 2. PSA. Be extremely careful buying used Nintendo Switch games. Bought an old copy of Bayonetta 3 on eBay, and welp, my 1-month-old $450 Switch 2 is banned. This cart must have been dumped by whoever owned it before me. Hoping Nintendo will understand / unlock for me, else this sucks. Or else is what I would say. And then you see a picture here of the system being banned. A very bougie television, you know, like the gold picture frame. I like it, but I can never pull this off because, like, I don't know, like, it wouldn't make sense in my house. But very nice, very bougie, you know, living the life. Who is Snazzy Labs? Well, he is a channel that has 1.2 million subscribers on the YouTube here. You could see that they have bought a Cybertruck and he kicked it. and he sold it. And, you know, he does tech stuff and, you know, best tech, all this sort of stuff, self-driving cars. So it's not like this is just some random willy-nilly person on the internet just trying to put up a hate campaign against Nintendo or something like that, like many people think that there are a liege of people that are doing. So when you see this on the surface level, it is pretty spooky. You know, it does appear that this person is a trusted individual, someone that is just into technology, somebody that purchased a used copy of Bayonetta 3 off of eBay and then put it in their Nintendo Switch 2. This game was dumped via a MIG Switch user, which has now banned the game, which would kind of tie in with that whole ID situation. But is that all that meets the eye with this? Is that actually what's going on in this situation? Because there is a wrinkle in this situation from Centro Leaks. RGT, why do you have Centro Leaks muted on Twitter? I don't know. I must have done that a long time ago. I also don't care about Pokemon stuff, and people like to like reshare Pokemon stuff a lot. So I didn't, you know, follow them anymore. But take this with a huge grain of salt, as this person has confessed to using the MIG Switch flash cartridge. We think the person may be lying here. So they're doing some investigative work, and you can see here, well, Mr. Quinn Nelson, Snazzy Labs, on April 5th, hope my Switch 2 continues to work with my MIG Flash game dumps. This is the best way to carry all your physical games all at once without risking a ban on an unmodded console. And you can see here, they got the little Legend of Zelda's Switch Lite here. I think that's a modded screen on there. That screen definitely looks a hell of a lot better than I remember my Switch 1 Lite looking. So I don't know, that could be a modded screen. But you can see here, sticking in the cartridge, changing out the games. What's going on here? Quinn Nelson, Snazzy Labs, our ginger friend. Quinn did have a response. I never used it on the Switch 2. You can choose to believe me or not, but that's the truth. I don't care. So now we have a bit of a wrinkle in this situation. And do I think that this had to do with MIG Switch stuff and potentially Mr. Quinn Nelson, Snazzy Labs, our ginger friend, utilizing a copy of Bayonetta 3 on their MIG Switch and then messing up their Nintendo Switch 2? I think that is a strong possibility. I do think that is a possibility with this. I'm also not necessarily saying that he is guilty of doing that. All because you own a MIG Switch doesn't mean that you used it on your Switch 2, because, I mean, by that logic, all because you have a car doesn't mean you ran over someone. You know what I'm saying? I think this does propose a bigger question, though, because let's take this at face value. Let's just take it at face value as far as, you know, what the initial story said. And when you look at the initial story, be extremely careful buying used Switch games. Buying an old copy of Bayonetta 3 on eBay, and welp, my 1-month-old $450 Switch 2 is banned. The cart must have been dumped by whoever owned it before me. That is a real possibility that could happen with Switch 1 games. Now, obviously, the MIG Switch community is a small community, and I always try to, you know, drive that home and you know, force that home on people, because there's not many people using a MIG Switch. There's not many people that bought a MIG Switch, and when you look at, you know, emulation and piracy in general, it's a very small segment of people. But there is a real chance that if you buy a game off of Facebook Marketplace, if you buy a game off of eBay, Mercari, whatever website you like to use to buy used stuff, you know, there is a chance that that game could have been dumped via a MIG Switch. And then if you put that cartridge into your Nintendo Switch 2 without knowing any better, your Nintendo Switch 2 can be banned from online play. And that's kind of a scary thing, I feel. You know, that's kind of something that I understand that it probably won't happen to many people. If you know, if there's 100 people, maybe one, you know, maybe 1,000 people, and like 1 or 2 are victims of this. I think that's kind of a better analogy. Maybe even more, maybe even 10,000. But still, you know, like it is kind of weird to think about that is a real possibility, because like I said, I believe that this is all tied into the cartridge ID that you end up getting when you are dumping it with the MIG Switch. And that's how MIG Switches are being detected, when there's multiple IDs of the same game utilizing the Switch 2 or going online. There's probably something that pings in a system or something like that, some sort of online system. I don't know. I don't know how any of that stuff works. I am not Quinn Nelson of Snazzy Labs, Everything's Computer. But what I am is a consumer who does like to buy used games. And as someone who likes to buy used games, like I just recently repurchased Super Mario Odyssey because I don't know what the hell happened to my cartridge. And like that's a potential that could have happened to me. If somebody used a MIG switch to dump that game previous to me, and I put that game in my Switch 2, which I have done, and thankfully nothing happened, like now there's a little bit of worry. There's a little bit of an increased layer of concern with buying Switch 2 games, because while there's a good chance it won't happen, there's still a chance that it will happen. And are you willing to take that chance with your Nintendo Switch 2? I'll let you guys decide in the comment section down below. But let me know what you think of everything with this. You know, do you believe his story? Do you think he just used a MIG switch and this is what ended up happening? But even if he did, like, I think that possibility does exist. And I think that possibility is something that, you know, might be a little bit concerning for some people, especially those who are constantly tapped in online. Let me know what you think of everything in the comments section down below. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Be sure to like, comment, and share. Hit the bell as well. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.